New York, 1975. Winter winds cut through the narrow streets like knives, and a young man walked alone with his hands shoved deep into his worn-out coat. His pockets held only a few crumpled dollars, barely enough for food, not even close to covering the rent that was already overdue. His name was Sylvester Stallone. Someday the world would chant his name, but on that night, he was just another forgotten soul in a city that had no mercy for the weak. He had tried everything. Countless auditions ended with cold rejections. Casting directors dismissed him with a glance. Some even laughed at his crooked mouth and slurred speech. "You'll never make it," they told him, and each word felt like a punch he couldn't block. His dream of becoming an actor seemed not only unlikely, but impossible. The walls of his small apartment were bare, the refrigerator empty. Days passed with little more than bread and water. And then came the lowest moment of his life, the day he had to sell his beloved dog, his only companion, just to scrape together enough money to eat. Handing over the leash broke him in ways hunger never could. Walking home alone that night, Stallone felt like a man who had lost everything. And yet, something inside him refused to die. In the silence of his apartment, under the weak glow of a single lamp, he began to write. He wrote with desperation, with anger, with hope. The story that flowed from his hands was his life disguised in fiction. The tale of a down-and-out boxer from Philadelphia who got one last shot at proving himself. He called him Rocky Balboa, but when Stallone finally showed the script around, Hollywood didn't see what he saw. Producers wanted the story, but not the man behind it. They waved checks in front of him, more money than he had ever dreamed of, but only if he agreed to let a real star play the role. To them, Stallone was nothing more than a struggling writer, not the face of their film. It was the cruelest temptation, instant escape from poverty, or the chance to protect the only thing that still gave his life meaning. He could take the money and vanish back into obscurity, or he could risk everything, even starvation, to bet on himself. Sylvester Stallone, with nothing left to lose, stood at the edge of a decision that would change his life and Hollywood forever. If you look right below this video, you'll see the red button that says subscribe. Click it and you'll be here to witness how this story unfolds. How a man who had nothing became a symbol of never giving up. Stallone held the script to Rocky in his hands like it was the last piece of hope he had left. He had poured his hunger, his failures, and his soul into those pages. Producers circled around it like vultures, eager to take it, but without him. The offers kept climbing, $10,000, $25,000. Finally, one studio offered him more than $100,000, an unimaginable fortune for a man who couldn't even pay his rent. For a moment, he hesitated. With that money, he could buy back his boat, move out of his crumbling apartment, live a life free from hunger. The temptation was brutal. But then he pictured it, another actor standing in the spotlight, delivering lines that came from his own pain, his own blood. Someone else would wear Rocky's gloves. Someone else would throw those punches. Someone else would embody his struggle. And Stallone realized that if he sold the script without playing the role, he would be selling not just a story, but his very soul. So he said no, again and again. He refused every check they put in front of him. Executives thought he was insane. Friends told him he was destroying his future. Even his own family worried he had lost touch with the reality. But Stallone knew something they didn't. Rocky wasn't just a character. Rocky was him. At last, one small studio, United Artists, took a gamble. They agreed to let Stallone play the lead, but only with a shoestring budget and unknown actors. No stars, no guarantees. The film would have to be made quickly, cheaply, and with almost no safety net. But Stallone didn't care. He had gotten his chance. Filming was chaotic, locations were stolen on the fly. The crew was small, the equipment old. Many scenes had to be done in a single take because there wasn't enough film to try again. But in that chaos, magic happened. Stallone wasn't acting, he was living. Every punch, every fall, every moment of doubt on screen was real because he had lived it all before. When Rocky was finally finished, it was more than just a movie. It was Stallone's life projected onto the silver screen. A story about every underdog who ever dreamed of standing tall, even when the world told them they had no chance. And soon, the world would see it. The film that nobody believed in was about to premiere. Nobody expected it to succeed. But in a few short months, Rocky would go from a forgotten, low-budget project to a cultural earthquake that would shake Hollywood to its core. When Rocky finally hit theaters in 1976, it carried none of the glamour or hype of a Hollywood blockbuster. It was released quietly, with little expectation, almost like an afterthought. Critics thought it would be forgotten within weeks. Audiences weren't even sure who this unknown actor with the strange voice and awkward smile was. But then something extraordinary happened. People who walked into theaters expecting nothing left, with tears in their eyes and fire in their hearts. Rocky wasn't just a boxing story, it was a mirror. Every worker struggling to make ends meet, every dreamer told they weren't good enough. Every soul who had ever been counted out saw themselves in Rocky Balboa. Word spread fast, packed theaters, standing ovations. Ordinary people lined up to watch again and again. Suddenly, Sylvester Stallone's name was on everyone's lips. The man who once couldn't afford rent was now being hailed as the voice of the underdog. The momentum carried all the way to the Academy Awards. Few believed a low-budget film with an unknown lead could compete with the giants of Hollywood. But when Oscar night arrived in 1977, Rocky stood tall among the best. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Film Editing. The movie that almost never got made walked away with the industry's highest honors. And there was Stallone sitting in the audience. Not a polished Hollywood star, but still that same hungry kid who once walked New York streets with nothing but a dream. He didn't win Best Actor that night, but it didn't matter. The world finally knew his name. For Stallone, it wasn't just about trophies, it was about proof. Proof that when the world tells you no, and you still stand your ground, miracles can happen. But Hollywood is a place that loves to build legends and then test them. Stallone's rise was meteoric, but what came after would challenge him in ways he never expected. The man who brought Rocky to life would soon face the crushing weight of success, and the fight for his career had only just begun. After Rocky turned the impossible into reality, Hollywood finally opened its doors to Sylvester Stallone. For the first time in his life, he was no longer begging for roles, he was creating them. But with that opportunity came an even heavier burden. He now had to prove he wasn't a one-hit wonder. The sequels to Rocky kept his name alive. But Stallone wasn't satisfied with just being the boxing guy. He wanted to create another character who embodied survival, resilience, and raw human struggle. Out of that hunger, another legend was born, John Rambo. When First Blood was released in 1982, audiences didn't just see an action hero. They saw a broken Vietnam veteran, discarded by his country, fighting for dignity in a world that had turned its back on him. The film was violent, yes, but at its core, it was about pain, alienation, and survival. And Stallone carried that pain with a truth that audiences could feel in every frame. By the mid-1980s, Stallone wasn't just a star, he was a cultural icon. The Rocky and Rambo franchises dominated theaters, turning him into the face of determination, grit, and unstoppable willpower. His physique, his voice, his relentless energy, they all became symbols of an era. Posters of Stallone hung in gyms, bedrooms, and barracks around the world. But with fame came pressure. Every studio wanted the next big hit. Every critic was ready to tear him down. And every fan expected him to top himself again and again. The underdog who once fought for a chance was now carrying the weight of global expectation. Success, Stallone realized, could be just as crushing as failure. He pushed himself harder than ever, writing, directing, training until his body was sculpted like stone. On screen, he was indestructible. Off screen, he was a man chasing perfection, terrified of slipping back into the shadows. The 1980s made Sylvester Stallone one of the biggest stars on earth. But behind the spotlight, cracks were beginning to show. Fame, fortune, and endless sequels could not protect him from the battles waiting in the next decade. Battles that would test not his muscles, but his soul. By the time the 1990s arrived, Sylvester Stallone was no longer just an actor. He was a brand. His face sold tickets. His name guaranteed box office success, until it didn't. Hollywood is a place that builds legends quickly, but it also loves to watch them fall. Audiences who once filled theaters for every Rocky or Rambo began to turn away. The sequels grew larger, louder, and more exaggerated, but the magic that had once made them powerful started to fade. Critics labeled him predictable, a relic of the 80s action boom. Tabloids mocked him. Scripts piled up that no longer carried depth, just explosions. And Stallone felt it. For a man who had clawed his way out of poverty with nothing but grit, to suddenly hear the world whispering washed up was like being punched harder than any blow he'd ever taken in the ring. Movies that were supposed to be blockbusters failed at the box office. He became the target of late-night jokes. Hollywood, once eager to chase him, began shutting its doors. For the first time since his early days of rejection, Stallone felt the weight of failure pressing down on him again. But this time with the whole world watching. Yet beneath the disappointment, that same fire still burned. He remembered the nights when he had nothing, the days when he sold his dog just to survive. If he had risen once before, he could do it again. But it wouldn't be easy. Reinvention never is. He returned to the gym, not just to sculpt his body, but to regain his spirit. He began searching for roles that could restore his credibility, stories that could remind audiences why they had believed in him in the first place. Still, each comeback attempt seemed to fall short, and the shadow of his past glory loomed over every new project. It seemed like Stallone's story was nearing its final chapter, a fading star destined to be remembered for what he once was. But life, like the movies he created, thrives on unexpected comebacks. And just when the world thought he was finished, Stallone was preparing for one last fight, the kind that would redefine not just his career, but his legacy. By the early 2000s, many believed Sylvester Stallone's career was over. The industry had moved on, younger action stars had taken the spotlight, and Stallone's name was whispered with nostalgia, not excitement. But deep down, he wasn't done. His greatest character wasn't finished either. In 2006, Stallone returned to the story that had saved him 30 years earlier. He wrote and directed Rocky Balboa, the sixth chapter of the saga. Many dismissed the idea. Who would want to see a 60-year-old man step back into the ring? But Stallone knew it wasn't about boxing anymore. It was about proving that life, no matter how many punches it throws, isn't over until you say it is. When the film premiered, something remarkable happened. Audiences once again saw themselves in Rocky. The film wasn't just a sequel, it was a reflection of aging, of loss, of carrying on when the world says your time has passed. Critics praised Stallone for bringing depth and dignity back to the character. For the first time in decades, he wasn't being laughed at, he was being respected. But the rebirth didn't end there. In 2015, a new generation was introduced to Rocky through Creed. Stallone stepped into the role of a mentor, guiding Michael B. Jordan's Adonis Creed while wrestling with Rocky's own mortality. The performance was raw, emotional, and vulnerable in a way audiences had never seen from him before. That year, Stallone won the Golden Globe and was nominated for an Academy Award, almost 40 years after the first Rocky. It was the kind of full-circle moment Hollywood rarely delivers. The man who once couldn't afford food, who had been told he would never make it, stood once again on cinema's biggest stage, honored not as a muscle-bound action star, but as a true actor. But Stallone's story doesn't end in the ring. Even after decades of fame, failure, and redemption, he continues to fight. This time not just for roles, but for legacy. And the question remains, what does it mean to be a fighter when the greatest battles are no longer on the screen, but within yourself? Today, Sylvester Stallone is no longer the hungry young man wandering the streets of New York. He is a husband, a father, and a grandfather, carrying not only the weight of his own story, but the legacy of characters that inspired generations. At 70 and beyond, he still trains daily, still writes, and still steps in front of the camera with the same fire that drove him in his 20s. But his life now is more than just scripts and film sets. Family has become his anchor. Stallone often speaks of the pride he feels in watching his daughters grow, and how they ground him in a way fame never could. He has lived through failed marriages, personal heartbreaks, and public scrutiny, but he has also found strength in those struggles, using them as fuel to keep moving forward. The world still sees him as Rocky and Rambo, the indestructible fighter. Yet off-screen, Stallone has shown vulnerability, loss, and resilience that make him far more human than the roles he played. He knows what it means to start with nothing, to lose everything, and to rise again. That knowledge has shaped not only his art, but the way he lives each day. Even now in his late 70s, Stallone refuses to slow down. He creates, he mentors, he pushes himself to evolve. He speaks openly about aging, about fear, and about the importance of never letting the world decide when your story is over. "Keep punching," Rocky once said. And for Stallone, it's not just a line from a movie, it's his creed. He has become more than an actor. He is a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that no matter your age, your struggles, or your scars, the fight is never truly finished. But one last question lingers. When the lights fade and the cameras stop rolling, what does Sylvester Stallone want his final legacy to be? As the years roll on, Sylvester Stallone stands as one of the last giants of a bygone era. He is no longer just the struggling dreamer who once sold his dog for food, nor the chiseled action hero who carried the 1980s on his shoulders. He has become something greater, an embodiment of resilience, of falling and rising, of never letting the world dictate the limits of your story. When fans see him today, they don't only remember the boxing ring or the jungle battlefields. They remember the spirit behind those images, the message that no matter who you are, no matter how many times you've been knocked down, you can always rise again. For millions, Stallone is not just Rocky Balboa or John Rambo. He is a mirror of their own struggles, their own dreams, their own fight for dignity. In interviews, his voice has softened, but his words carry more weight. He speaks not only as a movie star, but as a man who has known both extremes: fame and failure, glory and ridicule, wealth and despair. And in that duality lies the truth that makes him timeless. He is proof that greatness is not measured in victories, but in persistence. His legacy now stretches far beyond the screen. Younger actors look to him as a mentor. Fans bring their children to meet him, explaining that this man's movies once gave them the courage to keep going. Soldiers returning from war speak of how Rambo reminded them they were not forgotten. Fathers and sons still gather to watch Rocky together, passing down a ritual that has outlived decades. And through it all, Stallone himself remains humble about his place in history. He knows his career was built not only on muscle and grit, but on vulnerability, on the courage to show weakness, and the strength to keep going anyway. That is why, even as he steps into his later years, audiences still lean in when he speaks. His presence carries the weight of lived truth. For Stallone, the fight was never just about the movies. It was about life itself, about reminding every underdog that their story matters, even if no one else believes it. About proving that age does not end dreams, and that scars, whether on the body or the soul, are not signs of defeat, but of survival. As the lights fade on his career, one message echoes louder than all the applause, louder than the box office numbers, louder even than the Oscars. It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Sylvester Stallone has lived those words, and that is why, long after the final credits roll, he will remain more than a star. He will remain a fighter, a storyteller, and a symbol for anyone who has ever stood in the shadows and still dared to dream. These stories are not just about Hollywood. They're about us, about you, about me, about everyone who has ever fought for a dream. If you want to keep these legends alive, and if you believe in the power of stories that remind us never to give up, then click the red subscribe button below. Because the fight goes on, and together we'll keep moving forward.